Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, good day, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, excellencies, very, very warm welcome to this webinar. And apology for starting 2-3 minutes late. I can see that many others are still continuing to join us, so we really, really appreciate that. I can tell you that you have made a right decision by joining this webinar. You will not regret it. I'll tell you in a minute why you will not regret joining this webinar. Firstly, let me welcome you all, and in particular, welcome the executive mayor of the city of Tshwane, who is also the co-chair of the U20 in 2025, Mayor Nasipi Moya, who is with us and will address us in a minute. Thank you very much, ma'am, for making sure that we have this event taking place as it does today. I know that everybody or people come or are in different parts of the world, which is why I greeted you for all the times of the day, depending on which one of those times applies to you. The mayor will welcome all of us. Before I hand over to her to welcome all of you to this webinar, I just want to make a few observations about the importance of this webinar. As you know, the evidence from around the world shows that growing economies usually have very well run and thriving cities in them. And it's not difficult to understand why this is so, because cities have particular attributes that enable them to drive economies and make sure that they create conditions for success. But cities also face threats from climate change, and those threats, unless they are addressed, they threaten the safety of their residents, they threaten the quality of the living environment of their residents, they threaten their livelihoods and their access to resources and opportunities. However, informed leadership by city leaders and the adoption of appropriate urban management practices, the selection of appropriate building technologies, targeted investments, and the commitment to drive execution can not only make cities resilient, but also makes them thrive. Now, cities tend to concentrate industries and various other forms of economic activity. They have large populations larger compared to rural areas and small towns. Cities also bring people together. They bring producers of goods as well as the consumers of goods together, which makes for economic dynamism. They have concentrated investments in infrastructure that drive economic activity, such as transport and logistics networks, energy infrastructure, storage facilities, water infrastructure, to name a few. And the concentration of people in cities does not only expand markets, but it also increases the pool of skills from which companies can choose their workforce. In this context, people compete for opportunities and they continuously upgrade their skills to stand out from the rest and access better job prospects. This in turn drives competitiveness. In cities, There are more universities, there are more specialized research centers, facilities for training artisans than anywhere else. And finally, because of all of these attributes of cities, cities provide better opportunities for technological innovation, which is necessary for advancements. They also offer better opportunities for driving economic inclusion. However, for these opportunities to materialize, careful planning, investment, and focused attention on execution are required. And so in the rest of this webinar, we will hear from experts from various fields who will share with us their knowledge and insights on how cities can best position themselves for opportunities available to them in leading the growth of their economies in an inclusive manner. So to kick us off, I'd like to invite, as I have said, the executive mayor of the city of Tshwane in South Africa, who is also co-chair of the U20, Urban 20, during South Africa's presidency of the G20 in 2025, to offer welcoming remarks to all of us. Over to you, Honorable Mayor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mate, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the distinguished guests and colleagues and friends that are present on the platform today. It truly does give me a pleasure to address you today. This webinar, it comes at a time where I think as cities, we must be selective and be bold in terms of the conversation that we spend our time on. And I think for me, as the city that needs this conversation the most, focusing on fostering inclusive economic growth, I think it's one of the topics that we need to be bold about as cities. I'm particularly pleased with the diversity of voices in this platform. I see U20 member cities, observer cities, I see agribusiness leaders, industry executives, researchers, policymakers, and entrepreneurs. So your participation in today's attendance, colleagues, it's very instrumental in us taking forward the conversation about the future of the cities. So today we gather against the backdrop of persisting poverty and deepening inequalities in our cities. In Tshwane alone, 22% of residents here live below the poverty line, while the unemployment rate stands at 39%, disproportionately affecting young people. Regrettable, this challenge is not unique to Tshwane or Joburg, but it's a widespread issue plaguing communities worldwide. As cities house more than half of the world's population, they must remain at the forefront of sustainable and inclusive economic growth to drive meaningful change. This is a moment for a call of action for cities as engines of economic prosperity. Their success is intrinsically linked to how well we create opportunities that are accessible to all who call our cities their home. In an era of uneven recovery and financial constraints, cities must establish an enabling environment for local economic development. This means ensuring efficient and transparent regulatory frameworks, robust local financial systems, strategic local procurement policies, and fair land use policies. Governance plays a pivotal role as inefficient regulatory systems remain a significant obstacle to urban economic growth, particularly in developing nations. However, we acknowledge that financing sustainable urban development remains one of the biggest challenges for cities, especially those in the global south. Many cities grapple with limited revenue streams, difficulty in accessing loans and investment, excessive debt servicing costs, and taxation burdens. Furthermore, gaps in governance and financial expertise hinder their ability to attract and manage investments alone. Despite these challenges, ladies and gentlemen, we must seize the opportunities before us. by fostering partnerships, driving innovation, and promoting entrepreneurship, especially among young and marginalized communities, we can unlock the full potential of our cities. Collaboration and knowledge sharing will be key in stimulating local economies, attracting sustainable investments, and building the financial resilience of our communities. Therefore, this webinar presents a unique opportunity for us to engage in a constructive dialogue, exchange best practices, and identify innovative solutions that will pave the way for inclusive economic growth. We anticipate that the outcomes of our discussions today will not only inspire change within our respective cities, but will also contribute to the global discourse on sustainable urban development. Some of the recommendations from this engagement will be included in the communique to the G20 presidents in which South Africa is hosting this year, ensuring that our voices are heard on the global stage. So, esteemed attendees, each of you brings unique expertise and insight, and together we can lay the foundation for an equitable, resilient, and prosperous urban future. My plea to you is that let's use this platform today to forge bold, actionable solutions that will shape a more inclusive economic landscape for generations to come. From my side, as one of the co-chairs of U20 2025 cycle, I'm very looking forward to this conversation today and how we can start practicalizing the solutions that we are talking about, and ultimately show the capacity and capabilities of the cities in trying to resolve the challenges that plague us. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to the engagement.
Thank you very much, Executive Mayor Dr. Moya, for those welcome remarks. And so let me, now that the Mayor has welcomed all of us here, let me introduce myself, your facilitator. My name is Kulegani Mate. I am Chief Executive Officer of an organization called Business Unity South Africa. That is the apex business body in South Africa, representing all businesses with all industry associations affiliated to it. I promised you that you will hear from an excellent panel of experts covering a wide range of issues. I will waste no time in introducing them to you. Before I do so, I just want to say a few things. One, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So I ask that you post your question in the Q&A function on Teams, not the normal chat line, but the Q&A function, so that we can pose your question to the relevant panelists when the time comes. So the panelists' bios were circulated, as I understand, so I will not read bios. Let me introduce all of them at the same time, so that after that I won't have to go through the intros. First up will be Ms. Camille Virosh, who will be talking to us about inclusive growth in cities, trends, and drivers. She is head of inclusive growth in cities at the OECD. Ms. Virosh, if you can just wave so they know who I'm talking about. And then the next panelist will be Mr. Paseka Lisolang, who is Chief Executive Officer of an organization called Water Hygiene Convenience in South Africa. He will be talking to us, giving an African perspective and talking about support mechanisms required to drive inclusive economic growth, and the case of a young entrepreneur from Ga-Rankuwa Township in Pretoria, which is our capital here in South Africa. The third panelist will be Professor Mauricio Rodas, who is former mayor of Quito in Ecuador. He will be talking to us. He's currently visiting professor at University of Pennsylvania. He will be talking about what do cities need to successfully unlock economic opportunities and access sustainable financing for inclusive growth and development. I look forward to hear his views on that. And finally, Professor Keshi Karuri Sabina will, and there she is waving, will do the summation at the end. She is from the University of Witwatersrand here in South Africa, and she will be providing a summary and chatting the common urban city agenda. So those are our panelists, and without wasting any more time, I would like to now invite Camille Giroche to start us off and give us her perspective. Over to you, Camille.
Thank you very much, Kule Kenya. I hope you are hearing me well. So good afternoon. Thanks. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation. It is my great pleasure to be with you all today and to give you a few reflections on inclusive growth in cities, trends and drivers. I'd like to highlight 3 main points today: the why inclusive growth in cities is important, the what can drive inclusive growth in cities, and finally the how policymakers can ensure policies drive inclusive growth in cities. So first, the why. As we know, and as the executive mayor just said, cities are home to a bit more than half of the world's population and are economic powerhouses, generating 80% of global GDP, and they provide better opportunities for jobs, education, and leisure, for example, than other types of regions. However, cities exhibit higher levels of income inequality than national averages. In 19 OECD countries out of 24 for which we have data, capital regions experience higher income inequality than country averages. And in the European Union, for example, it is true in 14 out of 18 countries for which we have data. So inequalities occur both between and within cities, and within cities, higher inequalities can be the result from polarized economic opportunities and also from a higher cost of living. Another important point is as to why it is important to implement inclusive growth policies in cities is that inequality in cities is multidimensional and extends beyond income. For example, low-income neighborhoods are generally more vulnerable also to health risks from heat. In the city of Lyon in France, for instance, data shows that neighborhoods most exposed to urban heat island effects are also the neighborhoods with the lowest incomes. Furthermore, green space access is uneven across city neighborhoods. OECD data shows that about 1 in 4 people living in OECD city centers cannot access a green area within a short walk. And in some countries, the share of people in cities who do not have access to green space is even greater in bottom income urban areas. Another example of inequality that goes beyond income in cities is inequality in life expectancy, which can differ drastically between neighborhoods. In London, for example, in the UK, life expectancy can vary by as much as 5 years between neighborhoods of the city. It's important to foster inclusive growth in cities because failing to address inequalities in cities can incur economic and social costs and diminish citizen welfare. This is what we call the cost of inaction. For example, evidence shows that a 3 percentage point increase in the Gini coefficient can reduce GDP per capita by around 8.5% over the long run. Inequality can also lead to social unrest and violence, which can undermine investment and consumption. Educational disparities also hinder intergenerational mobility and can exacerbate income inequality. And also failing to address inequalities can lead to the perpetuation of inequality and discrimination, especially for vulnerable groups, which can limit their participation in society. On the other hand, and conversely, fostering inclusive growth in cities delivers wide economic and social co-benefits. Evidence shows that cities with more inclusive neighborhoods, with lower segregation and stronger social networks can drive economic mobility, particularly for disadvantaged groups. Inclusive growth can also strengthen cities' resilience to economic shocks, to public health crises and climate-related challenges. And driving inclusive growth in cities also promotes the right to stay by providing individuals with economic opportunities to stay in the place that they choose. So cities are therefore critical places for addressing inequality due to their concentration of growth, of high-skilled jobs and investment, but also because of polarized labor markets that we can find sometimes in cities and higher levels of income inequality. So this was for the why it's important to drive and foster inclusive growth in cities. So now the what. What can drive inclusive growth in cities? At the OECD, we have developed an inclusive growth framework, which shows that inclusive growth in cities can be fostered across 5 policy pillars: education, labor market, housing and the built environment, public infrastructure and services, and a fair climate action. And this OECD framework also highlights that inclusive growth policy in cities should promote equal opportunities. It should be people-based, cross-sectoral, and place-based. So inclusive growth strategies implemented across these 5 pillars can also create self-reinforcing cycles of opportunity between social inclusion and economic growth. So this inclusive growth framework has 5 pillars, and let me just go through these 5 pillars quite quickly with some examples of policies implemented across these pillars. So the first pillar is education. As we know, education and skills development are fundamental to inclusive growth in cities as they shape future employment rates and household disposable incomes. Cities generally have higher levels of educational attainment than rural areas, but disparities persist within cities which often mirror socio-economic patterns. For example, children in deprived neighborhoods are also more likely to attend schools which have fewer educational resources or extracurricular activities. And in later life, these inequalities can persist. So for cities, investing in high quality early education and care is a cost-effective way to reducing inequalities and can bring sustained economic benefits. In France, for example, a program called Cité Éducative provides integrated education, social and community support services targeted to the needs of children in disadvantaged urban neighborhoods. So that was the first pillar around education. The second pillar is labor markets and policies that expand participation by tackling employment barriers can reduce economic inequality and address workforce exclusion. An example is in Athens, Greece, where evidence shows that policies that provide digital training for migrant entrepreneurs have improved their business operations and social integration. Finland is another example. It has established local one-stop shop guidance centers called Ohayaamu, which assist young people into work, educational training, and this service coordinates employment, social, and community services in one space. And early results suggested a positive impact from this policy, with 43% of youth who found some type of work through this instrument. The third pillar is housing and the urban environment. As we know, in most countries, the housing crisis is more acute in cities than elsewhere. The increase in housing costs has outpaced wage growth, leading to higher rates of overcrowding, eviction risk, and homelessness. And improving access to affordable and high-quality housing is a key driver of inclusive growth in cities as it promotes economic stability, social inclusion, and well-being. Many countries and cities across the OECD and beyond, of course, are implementing policies to improve access to affordable and quality housing, including to the most vulnerable. For example, the city of Florence in Italy has introduced an initiative that converts unused buildings into social housing to support young families and the elderly. That's just one example. The fourth pillar of our framework is public infrastructure and services. Inclusive infrastructure and public services play a crucial role in connecting city residents to jobs, education, and leisure opportunities. But access to public transport remains unequal. Almost 30% of people in mid-sized and large functional urban areas are unable to reach a public transport stop within 10 minutes. So that limits the accessibility of people to jobs and education opportunities, for example. And lower income residents also often face longer commutes, higher transport costs, and limited connectivity to jobs. So to help lower income households and other vulnerable people to access public transport systems, countries and cities are also introducing several instruments such as reduced fare for the most vulnerable people, such as children, the senior people, or people with disabilities. And finally, the last pillar of our framework is a fair climate action, because green policies also need to be carefully designed to avoid disproportionately burdening vulnerable populations. For example, in Ontario, Canada, the program called the 50 Million Tree Program enhances biodiversity and climate resilience, and also creates more than 14 jobs per 1 million Canadian dollars spent, benefiting especially underserved areas. So by implementing policies across these 5 pillars, education, labor markets, housing, public infrastructure, and a fair climate action, countries and cities can drive inclusive growth in cities. So we've seen the why inclusive growth in cities is important, the what can be done to drive inclusive growth in cities, and to finish, I would like to highlight very quickly the how, that is how to successfully implement these policies to drive inclusive growth in cities. So to successfully implement these policies to drive inclusive growth in cities, we've identified a set of cross-cutting enabling factors that are required to implement successfully these policies. The first one is good governance based on a multi-level and integrated approach, which requires alignment between different levels of government, between national, regional, and local policies, but also alignment between different sectoral policies. A second enabling factor is sufficient financing by leveraging diverse and innovative financing tools such as public-private partnerships. A third enabling factor is that governments need to foster stakeholder collaboration and strengthen citizen participation. And finally, policies need to be data-driven, that is based on evidence, by improving data collection and analysis to track inequalities in cities. So I will finish here, and I'm available for questions later. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Camille, for that really quick rundown through some of the critical factors, including why cities are important, what needs to be done, and how. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought there. I'd like to encourage you to post your questions to on the Q&A chat function if you would like to interact with Camille. Before we move to the next speaker, Camille, I would just like to talk to you a little. Now, obviously, the OECD is a club of rich countries and rich cities. Have you done any comparison, or rather looked at how the policies that you advocate would work in a developing country context? In other words, I think the pillars are not difficult to agree with, but how do you apply these policy prescripts that you suggest in a developing country context? Have you done any work that attempts to do that, and what have you found, if any?
Thank you very much for your question. So, as you said, the OECD is, we have 38 member countries across the world, but we do also work with countries outside these member countries. And what is interesting, I think, is that the challenges that we identify in OECD countries are also often the same in developing countries, and many of these recommendations that we give, or the solution, the policies that we identify can be replicated, of course, adapted to the local context. But I think that's an interesting point. And I just wanted to mention also a network of mayors that we have. It's called the OECD Champion Mayors for Inclusive Growth. And we have about 70 mayors in this network who are, committed to reduce inequalities in their cities. And this network goes beyond OECD countries. So we have mayors in our network who are also from countries from outside the OECD. And when all the mayors sit around the table, when they discuss, it's very interesting to see that the challenges that they face are very common, usually around, housing, accessibility, all these issues, and they can discuss together the solutions that they can implement in their own local context.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that response. There will be opportunities later to interact with you and put more questions to you. In the interest of time, let's move on to our next speaker. I have already introduced him, and this is Paseka Lisolang, who is going to talk to us and give us his insights based on his experience as an entrepreneur from Pretoria, a township called Ga-Rankuwa in South Africa. Over to you, Paseka, sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mate. May I please share my screen? I have 2 slides just to help our colleagues follow through on what I'm saying.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. Please confirm if you see what I see.
We see a black screen. Okay, now we see your emails. We really are not keen on seeing.
Yes, sir. I had to make sure I move away from that slide quick.
Yes. Okay. So we can see your presentation now. If you can just put it on PowerPoint for whatever slideshow. That's right.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much once again. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I trust that all protocols have been observed. It is both an honor and a privilege to discuss with you today an issue that is very close to my heart, but it is also fundamental to the future of all our cities globally, which is inclusive economic growth. Allow me to attempt squeezing 15 years of my journey and opinions into 10 minutes. I hope I will do you justice. Once upon a time, I was seated in my grandmother's house in Ga-Rankuwa, a township northwest of the city of Tshwane. I heard an annoying hissing sound coming from the toilet. I approached the toilet and closed the tap connected to the cistern, and the sound stopped. It was clear to me that it was this water that was causing the sound, but why didn't it stop automatically? I asked myself. Considering my grandmother's financial constraints as an indigent, getting a plumber was not an option. So I had to apply my mind. I started doing some research and came across some interesting leak detection tests and facts. If you take food coloring and dilute it in the water inside the cistern, after a few minutes or seconds, if the colored water starts appearing in the pan, it is a clear indication that you have a leak. Now, further on to that, according to Rand Water, Africa's leading water utility, the toilet is the single largest water consumer in the house, consuming approximately 29% of the household usage. Rand Water also stated that toilets inevitably leak, wasting over 250,000 liters of water per year. That is equivalent to 2,500 bathtubs per year. This explained the ever-increasing water bill from the city of Tshwane. The bigger problem was that this increasing water bill was directly correlating to my grandmother's blood pressure. Automatically. Am I still audible?
Yes, we can hear you. We lost you for a short moment, but please proceed.
Thank you very much. So I sketched the rough solution of how this toilet leak can be stopped automatically. To my surprise, it was an invention. According to the World Health Organization, I found out that South Africa is the 30th driest country in the world, and our water consumption might exceed availability of supply by 2030. This research was supported by our government's research. So I went to the various government departments in order to contribute to our water security. However, I was tossed from one person to another. Eventually, I was interviewed on a national radio station, Motsweding FM. I got calls as far as Botswana asking two questions. How much does it cost and where can I get it? That's when I noticed that, well, not only can this be a solution for my grandmother's toilet and contribution to water security, but this could be a business. So I started WHC, which is a water efficiency management company. The first product was the leakless valve, which is a device that can be retrofitted into toilet cisterns to identify leaks and save up to 84% of the water that would have been lost, including the money that is used to pay for this water. I got a quote from an industrial engineer on the cost to design the product. I obviously could not afford it. So I approached venture capitalists and investors to support me develop this product. They told me once I have the product, they will give me the funds. So this was the typical beginner's chicken and egg situation. And so the journey began. I started using composite materials in my grandmother's garage to develop demonstrators. After several years of struggling to develop prototypes due to insufficient funds, I had iterated over 70 times to get to a market-ready product. I relied on awards and some government grants, which were just enough to get me to the next petrol station, but never enough to get me through the entire destination. Finally, the city of Johannesburg and the city of Tshwane gave me a platform to pilot the fully functional prototype. In the city of Tshwane pilot, we managed to create 20 jobs after training local youth to be certified plumbers and install 865 units in the community, leading to a saving of over 120 million liters of water to date. Due to this success, I had interest from toilet manufacturers to procure the product, but the existing suppliers told them that if they were to procure my product, they would stop supplying them their products because my product is very disruptive. This was what I call industrial sabotage. After the successful pilot at the city of Tshwane, there was a new administrator in the city of Tshwane. I approached the mayor with the hope that we would scale the impact of the project. But he told me that he cannot be seen to be advocating the successes of the previous administrator. This was political sabotage. With limited resources, I had to be a jack of all trades in the business and obviously a master of none because I could not afford experienced professionals to delegate most of the tasks to. This was individual sabotage. There has been many other challenges, including but not limited to personal challenges, family challenges, unforeseen challenges, malicious individuals trying to sabotage us. Enough challenges for any sane person to quit this entrepreneurship thing. But hey, only the crazy keep on keeping on. And there I was. I kept going. Today, WHC is a multinational award-winning company, and gratitude to the city of Tshwane's pilot success, we have been approached by Massmart, a division of Walmart, to patent the product and supply to their stores in 40 countries. Based on my traveling exposure and experiences, these are my recommendations to governments. Firstly, there are programs that avail interns to young companies. However, inexperienced interns working in youth-led companies is like the blind leading the blind. I encourage you to also incorporate experienced unemployed adults into youth-led companies using resources like the unemployment insurance funds and others to support this program. Secondly, when I went to China for the first time, we were taken to an incubator where young technology entrepreneurs like myself were given a full team to complement the technopreneur's weaknesses. What takes an entrepreneur 15 years in Africa takes those entrepreneurs 2 to 5 years to accomplish. Therefore, I recommend you create incubators and accelerators that avail a team around the entrepreneurs, not just mentorship. Thirdly, it also came to my attention that these incubators were supported by the Chinese government, and the government had availed a budget to procure these innovations from the entrepreneurs, and then further assisted them to market their solutions to the world, to ensure that they are sustainable beyond the government orders. Therefore, I would recommend that you make procurement of innovations much easier, especially publicly funded innovations. When I went to America for the first time, the impact investors there were keen to know how many times you have not succeeded at what you were trying to do, and what lessons have you learned from the process, as a criteria to give you more support. Therefore, I encourage governments to create a platform to allow innovators to pivot, convert failure or the term fail to first attempt in learning. It would also work to advantage if you were to avoid politicizing innovation, impact, and progress, because some technopreneurs will leave your country to go boost the economy of another country that appreciates them. When I went to Spain for the first time, my counterparts already had purchase orders from their municipalities before they started developing the solutions. Therefore, I would recommend that it is rather in your best interest to create a conducive environment from concept to commercialization. When you avail financial support to entrepreneurs, I would also recommend that you accommodate their living expenses as well, because they are also human. They need to eat, sleep under a roof, afford transportation and communication in order to complete the project. We are now entering a digitally driven era, and entrepreneurs need to be well equipped to add value in the economy. Therefore, I strongly recommend you also improve your infrastructure and digital connectivity resources. Last but not least, circumstances differ from country to country. I would recommend that you involve your various entrepreneurs in your policy development and regulatory reformations. Nothing about entrepreneurs without entrepreneurs. Ladies and gentlemen, I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Paseka. As you can see, those hands clapping for you there. We really appreciate the insights that you have shared with us, clearly showing that it is possible to start from your grandmother's kitchen, backyard, and grow to be a multinational company. Of course, time doesn't permit for you to walk us through the full journey, how you made these big transitions into where your business is today. We will have an opportunity to interact later, but there's one thing I want to check with you, because you tell us about what your counterparts in China, in Spain, and everywhere, and the kind of environment that they have, which I can imagine you wished you had when you started. Have you paid attention to what specific policies and at which level of government, is it at a municipal level, that enabled these things? So you said Spain, for instance, the local authorities can purchase the thing even before it's produced. Is there a set of such specific policies that you think are important to enabling entrepreneurs to succeed? Because it's well and good to say cities provide the environment, which is true, but there may be specific hindrances.
Absolutely. I believe that these would fall within the procurement process. First and foremost, the countries that I had mentioned, specifically Spain, they have a list of their priorities as a country. And if there are innovations that address their challenges and would effectively manage to solve some of their challenges, they give them priority and make sure that they adopt them when they are right. So they, for lack of a better term, they find a way to relax, if not create a particular policy to procure innovation. So when the innovation is ready, it is not subjected to what we would have as three codes, because we are talking about a patented product. It is novel, and technically there aren't any other products to provide three codes. So they don't beat about the bush going around in circles trying to get three codes and then stopping the process because there's insufficient codes. They ensure that, given there was a consensus from inception, to then adopt the innovation to ensure that it mitigates the risks and challenges that were identified in the first place. So that is what I have learned, and I would encourage the countries on the platform to consider.
Thank you so very much, and hopefully everybody here takes to heart your suggestion that how the procurement systems and policies are structured can assist or they can kill innovation. Thank you so much, Paseka, for that excellent presentation. Let me now bring into the conversation Professor Rodas, who will talk to us about what cities need to successfully unlock, to do in order to successfully unlock economic opportunities and access sustainable financing for inclusive growth. Over to you, Professor Rodas.
Thank you so much to Mayor Moya and the whole U20 team for this kind invitation. It is going to be a bit hard to follow Paseka's inspiring story, but I'll do my best. First of all, I would like to point out what Camille just mentioned. Right? Cities are really where the action is happening. Cities now are the home of more than 50% of the world's population. It is estimated that by the year 2050 will be 70% of the world's population living in cities. It is in cities where 80% of GDP is being produced. So it is where economic activity is thriving, including many innovative entrepreneurships like the one Paseka just shared with us. But also it is in cities where we are dealing with some of the world's most pressing challenges. Camila mentioned the issue of poverty, inequality. Also cities, for example, are responsible for 75% of CO2 emissions. So without an effective role from cities, it will be impossible to achieve the 2030 agenda. It will be impossible to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. It will be impossible to meet the Paris Agreement. So that's why it is so important to empower cities, providing them the necessary access to financial flows. It is estimated that cities will need approximately $4.3 trillion per year from now until 2030 to turn their infrastructure into a climate resilient one. Now, under the current global financial architecture, it will be impossible for cities to access such high amount of financing. Why? Because we are living under a country-focused international financial system. This international financial system was designed back in the 1940s under Bretton Woods, when the world was not nearly as urbanized as it is today. Now, clearly, things have changed. We live in a highly urbanized world in which, as mentioned, cities are dealing with some of the world's most pressing issues. And in order to do so effectively, they need access to resources, to financial resources, but they cannot do so appropriately because we are living under a national-centric international financial system. It is a system that was designed to fund national governments, not local governments, not cities. And we can exemplify this by a number of facts. For example, only 44% of countries in the world allow cities to borrow from international markets. Only 44% of countries. That means that in the other 56% of countries in the world, cities are proscribed from accessing international financing. Take the multilateral development banks. Who govern the multilateral development banks? National governments. We have ministers of finance from national governments sitting in the boards of the multilateral development banks. So therefore, there's very little incentive to change the rules of the game. For example, on how the money from the multilateral development banks is being allocated. How that money is being allocated? Usually through national governments. They are the ones who distribute the money in the respective countries. They are the ones who control how the money is allocated, not cities, not local governments. So the point that I want to make is that we must reform the international financial system to make it more cities friendly, to empower cities to do what they have to do to meet very important global agendas like the SDGs or the Paris Agreement. Now, another example on how country-focused the international financial system we live in is the fact that even in those 44% of countries in the world where cities are allowed to borrow from the international markets, in many cases, cities need a national government's sovereign guarantee to access loans. A national government sovereign guarantee that very frequently is not granted because of political rivalries between the national and the local government. Something that unfortunately I had to experience personally when I was the mayor of Quito and I wanted to build the first metro line in my city and in the country. And I received the authorization from 4 multilateral development banks to fund this project, but I needed a national sovereign guarantee that the president didn't want to give me because of political rivalries. At the end of the day, I have to mobilize public opinion support in favor of the project to put political pressure on the president, and he ended up giving us the guarantee. We managed to receive the financing. We successfully built the metro line, which is now operating and transforming our city. This is a story with a happy end, but not necessarily that's always the case. I have spoken with many mayors around the world who have encountered a lot of difficulties when trying to access a national sovereign guarantee to therefore be able to receive international financing. So this is the kind of topics we should be addressing here. Also, we need to acknowledge that in many cases, there's also a demand problem, not also a problem regarding supply, meaning direct financial facilities for cities, but also we have a problem of demand in terms of having many cities around the world lacking the technical capacity to develop technically sound, fundable, bankable projects. So we need to also work on that very important component of the equation, supporting cities to develop institutional capacity to develop bankable projects. So this is the kind of work that I would like to see all of us discussing. And fortunately, the U20 has already been addressing this issue. For instance, during the last edition of the U20 under the co-chairmanship of the cities of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, many of these issues were discussed and specific solutions were found. For example, there is the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Global Commission for Urban SDG Finance, a commission in which Mayor Moya is participating, and I have the honor of being the executive secretary. This commission came up with a particular proposal to reform the international financial system and to foster the development of direct financial facilities for cities that don't have to go through the control of national governments. We came up with the idea of creating a Green Cities Guarantees Fund. This is a very concrete initiative that could unlock financing for many cities around the world that nowadays have as their only alternative, requesting a national government sovereign guarantee, which, as mentioned, it is very frequently highly politicized. So the idea here is that the Green Cities Guarantees Fund could become an alternative guarantee mechanism focusing on supporting cities specifically, and also allowing cities to access financing with better credit conditions, with shorter interest rates, with longer repayment terms, basically allowing cities to access financing in a more timely and affordable way. So the creation of the Green Cities Guarantees Fund was actually included in the U20 communique of last year. So it would be great to see also this year's edition of the U20 fostering this particular initiative, and therefore making it a reality as a concrete action, again, to allow cities to access the necessary international financing to develop climate resilient infrastructure and to meet the sustainable development goals. I think the U20 being a platform to engage with the 20 most powerful countries of the world becomes an amazing opportunity to foster this kind of discussions, to incentivize the creation of new direct financial facilities for cities, to empower them and to become drivers for prosperity and for improving people's quality of life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Rodas, for, again, that really interesting perspective on cities and their financing. You're saying something that I think many people who work in cities, mayors around the world, are very, very familiar with, including sometimes the politicization of instruments that should work for everybody. So I think you are in very good company, and I think there's a huge interest in what your suggestions are to overcome some of those very serious difficulties. So earlier we heard from Camille the importance of alignment between national government and local government. And you're raising an issue where the differences between these spheres could lead to crippling decisions. What would you suggest is a solution to that outside of the politics of, who runs the national state vis-a-vis who runs the city?
As mentioned, I think that we need to struggle to come up with international financial system that is more friendly to cities, that doesn't depend on national governments entirely. And for that, we need to create some other kind of institutionality. We need to create new direct financial facilities for cities. And I gave a concrete example, the Green Cities Guarantees Fund. If we come up with a guarantees fund of this nature, that it is technically managed, not politicized, this kind of guarantees fund would be supporting the development of those projects that would be meaningful for cities, that would be really addressing the needs for cities to develop more sustainable initiatives, those that are friendly with a changing climate, addressing poverty, inequality, and therefore supporting investments that are technically designed, not politically biased. I think that we, as a group of cities under the U20 umbrella, have an amazing opportunity to pursue this kind of agenda with the G20 countries, making the case of why it is so important for cities to have direct access to finance, and how that could be a game changer for pursuing in a much faster way the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals. I think it is even in the best interest of countries for these kind of reforms to take place, and therefore we have a great opportunity to make the case for that under the current edition of the U20.
I think you have made a very passionate motivation for the inclusion of this issue in the U20 communique. So, Mayor Dr. Moya, you have heard Professor Rodas there. Now, let's invite the rest of the panel for a discussion. Two questions were posed earlier on to Camille. They relate to technology, and I'd like to invite you to take both of them together. The first one from Refilwe is, what initiatives can cities implement to support digital inclusion and access to technology? Actually, it was from the same person. How can cities leverage technology to enhance inclusivity and accessibility? Let me also remind you all to continue posting your questions in the Q&A function, not in the chat function, so we can pick them up and put to the relevant panelist. Camille.
Thank you, Mr. Mate, and thank you very much to the attendee for the very interesting question. Technology can definitely help increase inclusion and accessibility in cities. One example is through smart public transport, such as real-time transit apps, for example, combined with public Wi-Fi hotspots. But it's also, I think, very important to have at the same time, in parallel, measures such as digital literacy training, because it's also very important to avoid the deepening of the digital divide, between those who are well equipped and technology savvy and those who do not have the technology or the skills to use it. So this together, having smart apps to help increase the accessibility, but at the same time making sure that the most vulnerable are not left behind is important. And also technology and data can also help drive inclusive urban planning. The use of data is very important, as I was mentioning earlier, also to identify gaps in accessibility for people. And another way of using technology also to increase inclusion in cities is to help foster citizen participation. And one example that is quite widespread in cities is online participatory budgeting, for example. So all these examples can help through the digital technologies increase inclusion and accessibility.
Thank you. Paseka, let me come back to you. Your story is really an amazing story. I don't know why I didn't know this story until today, and I blame it on you for not telling your story enough. I didn't have to wait for this webinar to hear this wonderful story coming from my backyard. You've obviously been on a journey, and you can look back and say, wow, what a journey. Cities, and you've worked with a few, you've experienced certain things from city of Joburg, city of Tshwane, etc. What would you think are the strategies for cities to really catalyze or opportunities, economic opportunities for the future? Sometimes we shoot ourselves in the foot and not be able to take up and use economic opportunities. Based on your experience, in what ways can cities become better at pursuing economic opportunities for the benefit of their citizens?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mate. And yes, truth be told, I could have done better to tell the story, but I wasn't on a quest to be famous. I was just on a quest to save water and create jobs. So, perhaps I should work on a proper marketing campaign. But nonetheless, to the question at hand, there are some initiatives that are being done by the various cities, especially the metros. I need to give credit where credit is due. It's just that they could do more. you touched on two cities in particular, city of Johannesburg. Now, the city of Johannesburg, they once did a competition called the Green City Startup Awards, and yours truly was the award winner thereof. And mind you, I'm from the city of Tshwane, having battled to get through to the city of Tshwane, given the political sabotage I had indicated. The city of Johannesburg saw this as a viable solution, but when it was time to scale it, they too had the challenge of change of administration, which is not a problem. The challenge was that they then couldn't have consistency throughout the execution of what they intended with the pilot, with the scaling impact. And then the same applied when the success was acknowledged by the city of Tshwane that the city of Johannesburg is progressing. That's when I got the attention of the city of Tshwane, but that was a long time in the making. There was another entity called the Innovation Hub, which I could not touch on in the interest of time. So the Innovation Hub is a state-owned to adopt the innovation and execute it from on a larger platform compared to the city of Johannesburg. In the city of Johannesburg, we were piloting on approximately 20 cisterns in a community hall. Then the city of Tshwane scaled it to availing 1,000 houses. And we managed to install 865 units on the basis that some households did not permit us to enter, considering or with the impression that this was a political campaign. So I am alluding to these aspects to say that politics has a very serious implication to the success of innovation. It's important for both the residents and the administrators to understand that they need to keep innovations neutral, and what is initiated, if it is to succeed, let there be a platform to scale it in order to ensure that the impact is there for the benefit of the cities. So those are some of the aspects I believe need to be done right. And then stakeholder engagement is also critical. In South Africa, we have a lot of demonstrations. Know an individual or an entity that is executing.
Okay, we have lost you. We've lost you there, Sega, so your line is really letting us down. Yeah, just your last thought to close off the conversation.
Yes, my last thought was that stakeholder engagement is critical. Communities tend to demonstrate if they are not aware of an entity or an individual from a different place. So it's important to communicate with all stakeholders involved to make sure that everybody knows it's to their benefit. And that's the best way to get public acceptance of innovation as well. So those are the key issues I'd like to address in the context of the audience in the room. But there are other technical aspects I would like to address. There are unforeseen circumstances that do occur in innovating, and hence the Americans termed it pivoting.
Okay, we'll leave it at that, Paseka, because the line is letting us down really badly. When we come back to you, perhaps we'll try and see whether switching off video improves the line for you. Because, So let's leave it there for now. We'll come back. I'd like to come to you, Professor Rodas. There's a question here, and let me just find it. I mean, it's a broad question, but I have no doubt that you will be able to tackle it. I mean, they don't call you professor and former mayor for nothing. And the question is, if we know why we need inclusive growth and how it can be achieved, why are we still struggling to achieve these? What else needs to be done to achieve inclusive economic development in cities? And how do we address the barriers? Right? So do you have a thought on this? I mean, this was not necessarily part of your presentation, but I think it's something that you would have first-hand experience in.
Well, there's a number of challenges that cities around the world, but particularly in the global south, are facing to achieve development, to improve people's quality of life. I would say that in many cases, cities lack the necessary legal authority in many fields to deploy initiatives that would be meaningful for the people. Remember, cities are the closest governmental entity to citizens. So, therefore, nobody knows better than local authorities what cities and citizens need the most. Unfortunately, in many cases, very important legal authority has not been provided to city to deploy goods and services that the population need, and in which the city and local authorities will be best positioned to deliver. So I would say, number one, there's an institutional issue. I think that cities should be empowered more strongly with legal authority to provide certain services that now, for example, are being part of some other kind of or so different levels of governments legal authority. So we need to explore how to decentralize certain aspects of public policy, but that should be accompanied by, of course, providing the necessary financial resources for cities to deploy those public services in an effective way, which again takes me back to our need to improve cities' access to finance. We need to work on cities' dependency on national government's financial transfers. In many countries, cities are highly dependent on these transfers, which again, unfortunately, in many cases are highly politicized. So therefore, how can we strengthen cities' capacity, for example, to be more effective to collect taxes? That's something in which we should be working. How can we develop technical assistance mechanisms for cities to become more institutionally capable to collect taxes more effectively? How can we provide cities with better technical tools for their employees to put together technically sound bankable projects? How can we, and this is a very important topic that we haven't addressed yet, how can we create the enabling environment to attract more private sector investment in cities? Something that Paseka just mentioned. How can we foster entrepreneurship in our cities? I think that in general, particularly in the global south, there's a lack of mutual understanding between city officials and the private sector. Why? Because the private sector, for the most part, has been used to deal directly with national governments, not so much with local governments. We need to change that. We need to engage the private sector from the early stages of projects in order to co-create projects with the private sector so as to make them attractive for private investment further along the way, and therefore to generate jobs and prosperity in our city. So if you ask me, I think it is about empowering cities with stronger institutional tools and legal authority to develop services in favor of the population, to foster economic activity and growth by creating an enabling environment for private sector investments and for undertaking new initiatives around entrepreneurship, and to take advantage of what the new digital transformation is bringing to cities. We need to pay very close attention to the impact of artificial intelligence in the future of cities, and how our cities will be governed and run, and how can we turn that into an opportunity to create more prosperity for our citizens.
Spoken like a true professor. From what I hear you say is that there's no point in the cities being closest to the residents if they do not have the resources, they do not have the policy instruments to address the problems on the ground. In other words, if governments are serious about addressing inequalities, make sure that the cities are equipped with the necessary resources, the legal instruments, the policies to be able to respond appropriately. That misalignment does not work for anybody. In South Africa, we have a thing we call unfunded mandates, where cities are expected to do certain things, but they do not have the resources to fund those programs that they are expected to carry out. Let me come back to you, Paseka, and I'll ask a question that has been posed, and I'll ask that you put your video off and let's see whether the line improves there. So the question is, are there any experiences or initiatives you know of on how to integrate the informal sector entrepreneurs into mainstream economy and strategies for inclusive growth in cities? In many instances, Paseka, what we find is that cities work against the informal sector. They do not enable it, they do not make sure it thrives. It's the sort of thing that must be shut down. So there is a formality bias in cities. Do you know of any such instruments and initiatives? Go ahead. Paseka, unmute yourself, Buti.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mate. Am I audible now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. I would like to bring experiences from one China and another from Brazil. While we were there, we were literally told of the markets that exist, and we were strongly encouraged to visit these markets, although we were told specific times, go with the translator, and obviously be safe at all times. They were encouraging us to go to these markets because these markets were well positioned in an urban setting. So they had stalls, they were paying their minimal rent, and they were acknowledged by government. And another thing, they were tax incentivized. So they were stimulating them to generate as much economic traction in order to be in a more not civilized, but more formal structure, and they were also channeling traffic towards them. So it's important for cities to acknowledge informal sector as aspiring formal entrepreneurs. In certain cities, if not in South Africa as well, 70% of the job creation is due to SMMEs. So SMMEs start off like me with an idea, and we use what we can to do the best that we can. From my grandmother's garage. So do not undermine small beginnings. And that's what I've seen in China and in Brazil. In China, they've dedicated 2 buildings, at least when we went to Guangzhou. They had 2 buildings, high-rising, that worked 24/7. I kid you not. For around the clock, you would be able to go into these informal traders to access certain goods which were not easily accessible to your commercial vendors because they were well off and, they were subscribing to all the other legal regulated times of operations. But in these sectors, because of these 2 buildings, the security was high and the trading hours were more flexible, and they had a lot of subsidies as well. So these are some of the initiatives that I know of, and our governments on the platform could consider designating certain areas, improving the security and the surrounding environment to make informal traders be a bit more appealing for all commuters, including foreign tourists, to come through to these markets. I hope I've done justice to your inquiry, sir.
Thank you very much. It is not up to me to judge your input, but thank you for your answer. I'd like to pose one question, which will be the last question, to Camille. And then after that, I will do a round of 1 minute each to all the speakers to just give us their closing remarks. Camille, a straightforward question from Professor Mukam, and that is, they would like to find out how the OECD is currently engaging with universities and research institutions in its work with cities? You can answer that.
Sure. So yes, I actually responded directly to the professor.
Oh, okay.
But no problem. And yeah, it's the collaboration with the universities is of course important, and I invite the professor we can exchange bilaterally.
Okay, great stuff. And colleagues, we're not able to answer all the questions that are here, and unless if you want to sort of respond to some of these, please feel free to do so. Before we actually close and hand over to Professor Yechi Kagurisebina, I'd like to invite each of the panelists to give us, in a minute or less, your closing remarks, your closing thoughts. Let's start with you, Camille, having been the first one. Let's ask you to also go first in giving us your closing remarks.
Thank you very much. And maybe what I wanted to say very quickly is also to respond to two other questions that were raised in the Q&A. One was around horizontal coordination, because what I think is important to mention is that often economic policies and social policies can be thought in silos. And here we were talking about inclusive growth. And so I think it's important that the policies around economic growth and inclusion are being coordinated together. So coordination is definitely important at the national and the local level, and also maybe highlighting again the use of data as very important in order to implement the right policies that are well targeted to the needs of the cities. But to be able to do this, of course, at the local level, strengthening the capacity of people who work in the local governments is of utmost importance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's come to you, Paseka, for your closing comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mate. I would like to obviously thank the city and all the organizers for having us here on the panel. It's a humbling honor indeed. And I would like to emphasize that as governments, you should not set aside policies for entrepreneurs without entrepreneurs. It would work to advantage to get the inputs of those that you are referring to. You can understand that with a journey like mine, one has encountered several circumstances which would not be picked up in a textbook, irrespective of the studies I've pursued in commerce. So it is best to get some of these insights directly from those who are experiencing it on the ground. Some of these things are good from a theoretical perspective to put in place, but it affects the common person on the ground in ways that you cannot imagine. So please do consult effectively so, and when you do implement, also have the relevant parties in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Professor Rodas, you said something that piqued my interest about the private sector, working with the private sector. And so coming from this private sector as I do, I really like that. Your closing comments.
Absolutely. I think the private sector has a vital role to play in order to foster well-being, poverty alleviation, and addressing inequality in cities. Public money will never be enough. I have argued about the importance of transforming the international financial system to make it more cities-friendly, but that in itself won't be enough. It's crucial to do it. But in addition to that, we need to engage more closely with the private sector. I think that there's a huge opportunity on that. And in order to do that effectively, again, city officials should need to understand better what the motivations of the private sector are, and vice versa. They have to come together and, co-create initiatives to foster economic growth and development. On a final note, just to mention that I am very excited to see this new edition of the U20 starting so strongly. I congratulate Mayor Moya, for the organization of this webinar. This is the kind of discussions we should be having in order to identify those key aspects that the U20 process should be addressing this year. I think that a very important, component of this process should be how to engage all cities, how to make sure that the U20 is taking into consideration not only the needs of cities in the global north, but all cities, because in many cases, needs in cities in the global south could be very different. How can we make sure that the U20 process is truly inclusive by listening to all cities and to present a U20 communique that is reflective of common urban challenges, those aspects that are key to improve people's quality of life, not only in the global north, but also in the global south, in the whole world. And I think that the way this U20 edition is starting is very promising to achieve that very important goal of this inclusiveness to all cities as a result of the U20 process. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. And I will now hand over to Professor Sabina. You can go over 15:30 by a few minutes. It's okay. I'm giving you the permission. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. And it's actually easy to do after these excellent inputs, I think, by our speakers. I've been asked to try and sort of close out in terms of saying what have we begun to chart out in terms of a common urban city agenda. And I think I picked out 5 big points. The first one appears, and I think Paseka's story just tells it so beautifully, is the need for us to really focus on economies that are driven by inclusive innovation, that we need to create accessible, enabling environments, not only at a national level, but really at that local level, at that city level, and not only for formal or sophisticated actors. Because especially in a low growth environment, which many of us find ourselves in, we've really got to have solutions that create efficiencies, that fix granny's leaking toilet, that address problems we actually have at a local level, which also generate economic opportunities, and they do not exacerbate inequality. And so I think we really have to prioritize that kind of innovation, and I think that came through very strongly. Of course, the question is, how do we create those enabling environments? We also had a very difficult 15-year journey. We've got to do better. We can celebrate movies like The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, but we're not all in completely hostile environments. We're meant to be in environments where cities want to enable innovators and entrepreneurs. So how do we do that? I think that leads me to the second point, and in fact, it's interesting. I think Prof. Rodas also ends up by talking about listening. We're being told that we have to enable participation. We've got to remove hurdles, and the first way is to acknowledge where we are perhaps not listening or not seeing what some of these common urban challenges are. We've heard the term data-driven used a few different times, but data-driven is not only what big research agencies produce. Data-driven is also listening to the entrepreneurs themselves, who are quite able to tell us whether things are working or not. So how do we get closer to that stakeholder intelligence in terms of what the public sector responds to? The third one, I think, appears to be around really strategic investment in foundational economies and social infrastructure. So as I was listening to Ms. Veros and the OECD framework, I think they're saying we really need to focus on those key sectors: housing, healthcare, education, those key services and basic needs, which themselves are also a source of employment and are really important to really promoting equity. So OECD has suggested a framework of how we can achieve growth, and they mentioned their issues like good governance and how we have better integrated governance. They mentioned financing, which is going to be the next point I think that was emphasized today. How do we also have the stakeholders collaborating, and how do we have those targeted policies that enable us to do that Paseka's story brings up? So the next issue, of course, is I think Prof. Rodas reminds us of the mandate for developmental local government and the kind of decentralization we may need, which is not only administrative decentralization, but is also fiscal decentralization. So how do we enable cities to generate and control a more significant portion of their revenues? And he makes a strong case for how this could be advocated very specifically through the G20. I think it's important for me to also just sort of mention here that, of course, we are quite aware that decentralization doesn't automatically guarantee positive and inclusive outcomes. And I think Prof mentions the capacity constraints that local governments can have in terms of having the skills or the technical tools. We also know there can be uneven development across local governments who are differently equipped. I think we always have to be concerned about elite capture and those who may use the power to benefit themselves rather than the broader population, the lack of coordination that can result from decentralization. But having acknowledged all of those challenges that we know very well, the question remains, how can we beneficially and responsibly enable cities to access what Prof calls a timely and affordable financing that they need in order to do this work of enabling vibrant economic conditions? And apparently some recommendations have already been tabled by the U20 in this regard. Within that comes up, obviously, the point about private finance. Finally, I think one that comes up quite strongly is the issue of digital opportunities that we can create through inclusive innovation and technology ecosystems. There have been other webinars on this topic, but I think Prof raises the question of how do we ensure even the AI-driven economy becomes something that's more equitably distributed or helps us achieve equity. I think in closing, Chair, I liked the question that Ms. Biros raised, the question of what is the cost of inaction. And I think Prof. Rhoda says quite clearly that we cannot achieve the SDGs without the cities. We cannot achieve the Paris Agreement without cities. We cannot achieve local growth without local innovators and entrepreneurs. So there is a natural cost of inaction. But also maybe to end with Paseka's point that, we've talked for a long time about brain drain, and that used to be the threat of what happens if you're not inclusive. But I think what we're hearing is not just the brains that get drained, it's also the talent. It is also the success of cities, or the potential success of cities. It's also the hope and aspirations of everybody who could have benefited from those successes. So I think lest we risk, in a country like South Africa, going from a context of migrant labor to now having migrant economies and migrant innovators and migrant innovations, I think let us really focus on perhaps the benefit of action, which is to respond to the question of today, which is how we actually grow inclusive economies. Back to you, Chair, and thank you to the speakers who I think gave a lot of fodder to respond to.
Thank you so very much, Professor Karuri-Sabina. And I think you all agree with me that it was a really good choice you made to join this webinar, because we could have had this conversation for the next 3 hours and nobody would have noticed, just because of how good a conversation it was. And this was because of this exciting panel of experts, starting with the mayor who welcomed us to this webinar, to Camille Baroche, to Paseka Lesolang, and Professor Rodas, and you, Professor Karuri-Sabina. Thank you so much for making this a successful webinar. And of course, there's a team that organized all of these, interacted with all of us, and made sure that all of this was a success. Thank you to the organizing team, and this webinar is now closed. And thanks to me.